Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Baker Institute. We're really delighted this evening to have our newest fellow in history at the Baker Institute for Public Policy and also a professor of history here at Rice University, Douglas Brinkley, who is well known, I'm sure, to all of you. As you can see in your notes, he's a prominent presidential historian and editor of the recent bestseller, The Reagan Diaries, and he's the author of over a dozen books, including The Unfinished Presidency, The Boins of Pointe du Hoc, and The Great Deluge, which won the 2007 Kennedy Book Award, and he contributes to many publications and media. The Great Deluge, which is the subject of his presentation tonight, Katrina, 2 years later, New Orleans and the Mississippi Gulf Coast, is a New York Times bestseller. One of the New York Times Book Review's notable books of the year, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize finalist, and as I said, winner of the 2007 Robert Kennedy Book Award. Dr. Brinkley has written bios of Jimmy Carter, Henry Ford, Rosa Parks, FDR, among others. He is one of the most prolific writers I have ever met in my life. I don't know, in his bio, not only is he married, they have 3 children. I don't know when you had time to have a family, but he's currently working on a book titled I So Declare It, Theodore Roosevelt's Crusade for the American Wilderness, which is due out in 2009. I'm sure you've all seen the recent publication of the Reagan Diaries. The box of the entire Reagan Diaries will be published in September 2008. So you can see there's a steady stream of publications that Doug is having come out. You probably saw an op-ed he wrote today on Big Bend, which is, I must say, typical of his writing abilities, his analytic skills, and his taking on controversial issues, which we love. He is also, and hold on to your seats on this one too, he's currently writing an investigative article about whether the Bush Library, the Bush 43 Library, should be at SMU for Vanity Fair. So it is with great trepidation that we'll be picking up our copy of Vanity Fair. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Doug Brinkley to the podium.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's a great privilege to be in the faculty here now. The last time I was at this podium, I was teaching at Tulane University and came and spoke, and I've decided to come here, and I've been very happy. I'm teaching 3 classes right now at Rice, one on the history of the Cold War, one on history of the American presidency, and one on Theodore Roosevelt and conservation, which is a graduate seminar. A group of my students are here. I see them trickled in and spread about, but thank you guys for coming. I appreciate that support. The topic at hand today, well, let me say one thing about the Houston. I wrote a piece in the Houston Chronicle today. I've been working very hard visiting our national parks, and I go to Big Bend National Park a lot, and then Dispute's been, you can read it in today's paper, I won't recap it, but if you read it, I want you to know, if you pull it up online with your paper, that we won this public policy battle, that the land commissioners backed off and has let this gift alone from the Mellon Foundation granted today. So it is an example of op-ed work having a net positive effect, at least as far as I'm concerned. Well, Katrina is a very emotional topic for me. My wife's from New Orleans. 2 of my kids are born there at Turo Hospital. I lived right near Tulane University where I taught. I used to work with the late historian Stephen Ambrose when we helped create a National D-Day museum there. I used to be director of the Eisenhower Center there, where we collected oral histories of veterans, on and on. So it's a city that I love greatly. And I was there for the hurricane. I boarded up my house, and my father-in-law had been the designer of a building called One River Place. If you're ever in New Orleans, it's right next to the Hilton. and it's a high-rise with a view right at the bend of the Mississippi River, the Crescent. And I thought, well, I'll take my chances on vertical evacuation. I was a fool. Literally, the reason I didn't want to get out of town is that I have my only phobia I have is bumper-to-bumper traffic. And the mere thought of being in the Exodus when I could just sit in this sort of top apartment or condo of this building. And for about 2 hours when the storm came, I was very bright because I collect books on the Mississippi. And National Geographic had commissioned Steve Ambrose and I. We traveled from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to Lake Itasca. The entire length of the Mississippi I've done by boat, motorboat, keelboat, canoes, helicopters, steamboat, and we did a book, Steve and I, for Geographic called Mississippi and the Making of the Nation. I collect first editions on books on the river. As an American historian, I agree with Jefferson. It's the spine of the nation, and I have a great love of that river. So there I was on top when Katrina came. Winds were blowing. And to my shock, the river was flowing backwards. And not just flowing backwards, the force of Katrina, it was white-capped, just rushing like a mad ocean or something in the opposite direction. And for about 15 minutes, if you combine, I opened like the open door and the power of the wind and the smell. People in books like mine, you can never capture a smell of a hurricane. But it's quite, for about a half an hour, it's magnificent. You sit there and feel the power of some entity up there that you feel small, but you can feel like with nature, and you realize how powerful a hurricane can be in a kind of natural way. And then, boom, the devastation hits. And the lights go out, and I watched the warehouse doors open across the river, and the rain was going horizontal, and the wires from telephones were dangling down like, dead spider legs, and debris was blowing. I had a dog with me. I tried to walk out, and it practically blew the dog away just to go out for a minute. And we had to then spend our time with the generator in the first floor of the building. When the winds finally died down, I have a reporter's gene in me. I try to suppress a lot, but I can't do it. I wanted to see what the damage was, and I went into the French Quarter, and my first view was not bad. Yes, shutters were down. Yes, there was damage in the French Quarter. As the saying goes, we missed the big one. And I felt quite good about it. And then I realized in 65 when Hurricane Betsy hit, it flooded the 9th Ward. And I thought, well, that's two areas. I wasn't going to make my way out to New Orleans East. Lakefront was a little far. But when you're in the French Quarter, it's not that hard to get to the lower 9th. You just cut over the bywater. I got in an SUV around debris on sidewalks, parked it, and I got stopped by a cabal of policemen, or I saw them there. I parked my car, and I did excuse me, officers, and every one of their faces swung around at me with sheer just terror on their face. And he said, "Get out of here, the levee broke." I was right near where the levee was on the lower 9th. We went down. We helped with rescue work at the lower 9th. I don't write anything about myself in The Great Deluge. It's all written in the past tense as a book of investigative journalism using a historian's trade crafts to write it. I'm just simply telling you this afternoon. It was very dramatic. I stayed there for a while, and eventually when I realized the whole city was going 80% underwater, I got in my SUV and I got my kids out of town, stayed here at first the Omni Hotel, where dogs are allowed, in Houston, and then we went to rented an apartment called the Royalton, which is right by Memorial Park, and stayed here and lived here when I wrote this book, The Great Deluge. And the President, Lee Brown of Rice, very kindly, and Secretary Baker invited me to dinner when I was in town, and David Lebron said, "Look, if you want to do some research on what happened, use the library here, and we'll give you a fax machine and a phone, and here's a pass from campus if you need something," which was exceedingly nice. I was a historian blown out of the storm, and Rice treated me that way, and it meant a great deal to me at the time, and still does. And I started writing this book, and I started doing oral history interviews. And I was spending a lot of time here at Reliant Park. I'd drive back into New Orleans. I went back and worked rescue boats the very week of the storm quite a bit around Central City, which is where that hospital, where the question of whether that doctor injected patients was. And I had not served in combat. I've interviewed a lot of people. It'll be the closest I've probably will ever come to personally be engaged in a combat-like scenario, in the sense that we were taking a boat that we had and pulling people out of buildings, and you would be passing up corpses in the water, all bodies bloated, you know, it was just that, everything that you thought it could be fires breaking out here. You didn't know whether it was toxic chemical. And I grew very frustrated about the response on about every level. Maybe I'm a romantic, and maybe I spend too much time reading how successful politicians behave, like George Marshall and the Marshall Plan, or Theodore Roosevelt and building the Panama Canal, and FDR and winning World War II and getting the factories humming. But it seemed to me there just was a breakdown on every level as I started writing the book. I wasn't unique on that. It's pretty much a consensus view nationally, but I really didn't have a bias or a prejudice when I started the book. For example, I had nothing against Mayor Nagin of New Orleans until I saw what an atrocious job he did during Katrina. I mean, or I didn't have any beef about FEMA and the Bush administration's response to the Florida hurricanes the year before Katrina. Truth be said, FEMA did a pretty good job in the Florida hurricanes in 2004. And I also want to say that there's undisputable heroism that took place during Katrina. The U.S. Coast Guard did perfect. One of the reasons the Coast Guard did perfect, as close as you can get for being a perfect job during this, is because of leadership. They had a man there named Captain Paskowitz and a Lieutenant Colonel Duckworth, who both were kind of water rats of the Mississippi waterways. They knew the local geography. They saw that Hurricane Ivan almost hit them a year before. They knew they didn't have a proper evacuation. Paskowitz busted the chops of the Coast Guard to say, if ever it even looks like it's a Category 1 storm, I want every Coast Guard asset removed from the city of New Orleans. We're setting a base of operations out of Alexandria, Louisiana. When the storm passes, we're going to come in and we'll do rescuing from outside the city, not within the city because it's below sea level. You know, pretty basic, but the logistics of that you can't wait till the storm hits to have the logistics in place. It's like military affairs. I mean, you had to plan it, and the Coast Guard did. They didn't, not one Coast Guard plane, helicopter, boat was lost. Every man and woman in the U.S. Coast Guard worked double or triple time. They put their lives on the line, burning out hours. Many of them lost homes of their own and continued working around the clock. It was a model of efficiency. I'm saying that about the Coast Guard, so when I really am hard on other people, you don't think I'm just difficult. I one's looking for things to praise. Fish and wildlife people of Louisiana, in Governor Blanco's only, one of her few, I should say, proper preparatory moves, had the boats of the wildlife people outside the gates of New Orleans. So when the flooding came, Fish and Wildlife got to utilize things. They did a pretty good job. And individuals did great. 8 police officers, 5 police officers, this police thing. And every single mayor in Mississippi did much better than New Orleans. You know, each mayor in all those towns you guys hear about, Long Beach, Gulfport, Biloxi, Bay St. Louis, they were first responders on the ground, grabbing garbage trucks, dump trucks, working around the clock, physically visible to everybody in their community along the entire Mississippi coast. So I'm going to focus today on New Orleans and what's happened since that 2 years. We all know Michael Brown got fired at FEMA, and Chernoff took some flack because he went to a disease control convention in Atlanta instead of recognizing the city was under fire. He's still on in the Bush administration. Nagin got reelected. People scratch their heads and wonder why. Wherever I go, it's the single most asked question I get if I ever talk about Katrina. Blanco's poll numbers are too low for her to run for reelection. It wiped out any of the main players. any of the named players in Katrina got wiped out. The question now is about preparation for another hurricane and where the city of New Orleans is at today. And let me say this. I started by talking about Theodore Roosevelt. 100 years ago, TR went to the barrier islands of Louisiana, Breton Island. It's the second national wildlife refuge in the United States after Pelican Island, Florida. TR physically went. There are great pictures of him looking at turtle eggs and while he loved being in those. And he warned 100 years ago, if these he wanted those islands preserved for bird rookeries, but he said they're also your security belt for hurricanes. That he recognized, being as brilliant as he was on conservation issues, that it's not a green or left or right issue, that it's a security of New Orleans issue. Because the barrier islands of Louisiana, traditionally, when the hurricane hits, they hit those barrier islands and it slows the surge down. And then when it would hit the Louisiana coast, it hits the wetlands, which serves as a sponge, would soak it in, and it would slow the surge. By the time the water starts pounding on the levees surrounding Lake Pontchartrain, it took the bite out of the hurricanes by having these barrier islands. Take a look at an aerial photograph, 1965, the barrier islands, and look at them today. They're almost gone. So we've lost the barrier islands, and then the wetlands. John Breaux, former senator of Louisiana, put through a very important act, the Breaux Act. He was getting some real money. I mean, he was getting $100 million being tossed into Louisiana. Some people thought it was pork, but he was given. The problem with Breaux Act money for wetlands is the money wanted to spread the wealth. So instead of concentrating on a project, it'd be, well, here's $1 million for this group and $1 million for that group, and you're about wetlands, here's $2 million for you, and it kept spreading the money out. It did do some important short-term measures. It couldn't handle the Katrina storm. Incidentally, the Katrina storm, as I hope you know, was not the big one. It was a Category 3 storm, not a 4, not a 5. Must keep that in mind when I talk about the future of New Orleans. We have not done anything since Katrina in 2 years to deal with the wetlands issue. That's on the table. Second problem, what do you do with these 350 miles of levees around the New Orleans area? Yes, the three major breaches, London Avenue Canal, 17th Avenue Canal, and Industrial Canal, have been fixed. But the fundamental problem of the below sea level neighborhoods has not been solved. Meaning, if you talk, and I've talked to top people from everywhere, what people tell you public and what the government officials tell you off the record become two different issues. I promise you, nobody serious in government thinks New Orleans is prepared to a Category 1 hurricane right now with the way the levee system is. That does not mean the Army Corps of Engineers is not working hard with what they can. Bottom line is, we're no better off now than we were 2 years ago. Evacuation of New Orleans will be easier because we lost so many people. So I'm not going to be stuck in traffic getting out. But the infrastructure of the city's in problems. The best way for us 2 years later to think about New Orleans is truly a city that's divided in two. Not racially. It's a different issue. It's a city of the above sea level New Orleans and below sea level New Orleans. Nobody is arguing about the future of the above sea level New Orleans, which is the port of New Orleans, the Mississippi, where 25% of all of our imports and exports go. 65% of all of American grain goes through the port of New Orleans. It's an essential port. Here's the bit of good news. The port of New Orleans is about 92% back since pre-Katrina. I'm saying 92. It fluctuates in the 90s, but it's in the 90s depending on the week. Back to meaning it's almost back. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because the Mississippi River levees never breached, A, but B, it's been a priority of Homeland Security to secure the port of New Orleans. For terror attack, if you blew up the Mississippi River Bridge, you'd shut down commerce, cripple America. And the need that, because the levees are so well built along the Mississippi, unlike the other ones around Pontchartrain, that's going to be the future of the city. The building of New Orleans, if you're going to invest in New Orleans, buy high-rises along the river. That's the future of the city. Cluster around the high ground. The high ground includes the French Quarter, the Central Business District, Uptown, and Garden District. The great news about that is the iconic New Orleans, the New Orleans most of you, this audience, are going to go to, is going to continue to exist. It's going to become much more like a Galveston. Big port, heavy on tourism, quick on getting out when a wind blows. Okay, Galveston got devastated in 1900, and almost 10,000 people died here in Texas. And what did people do? They moved to Houston, which is now the 4th largest city. There's a feeling out there that people need to get out of below sea level and move to Baton Rouge, move to Lafayette, move to anywhere. Baton Rouge is booming right now. It's becoming a big city. People are it's further up the river. It's getting away from the Gulf. Where this all slices with the levees problem and with the wetlands issue not being addressed is, I think nationally we have two main roles to think about for the future of the city. One is what I would call the Bush administration policy. It's a policy of inaction. It's inaction on purpose. Years ago, the late diplomat Paul Nitze, I had lunch with once in Washington, and I remember he said to me, always remember that inaction is a policy directive too. Like what you don't do is a decision. Not historians, he said, always look at the action. What did Truman do? I want to see the papers of his action. Look at what Truman didn't do. Look who didn't use the atomic bomb in this circumstance, or who didn't send extra troops in, or who didn't. Those are just as difficult of decisions. The Bush policy of inaction now is that when Dennis Hastert got slammed for saying that New Orleans can be a lot smaller city and you should get out, just slammed in the media. The president and his administration made a decision, it's too volatile. The racial issue is too heavy to sustain telling largely African-American communities like the Lower Ninth and the New Orleans East, don't come back. They weren't going to do it. So the Bush administration's created, this is the policy of our country right now, to those below sea level neighborhoods. Come back. Who's stopping you? The problem is, it's disingenuous. How do you expect, in the Lower Ninth, which is often portrayed in the media as a poor black neighborhood, it was 65% home ownership, and it was higher than many of the white neighborhoods. But the Lower Ninth, the problem with telling people to come back is it's disingenuous. There are no schools, there's no garbage pickup, there's no electricity, there's no sewage, there's no water. How can you tell those people to come home? If the city isn't going to provide, or the state or the federal government, anything for them, then it's disingenuous to tell these people to come home. Yet people are very attached to neighborhoods. One of the things I've learned in writing this book, and it's not New Orleans centric, I've been standing in Waveland talking to people that I'll say, why are you, they're like rebuilding back where their home was just blown down. And they will tell you, I went to high school here, and my daddy and mommy are down, buried in a grave there, and I'd just as soon die in Waveland. It's like, well, you don't want to move inland 20 miles? It's cheaper land. You can drive to the beach down the road and spend a fish and then go home. And it's like, no. People's neighborhoods and communities. I grew up, my parents were teachers. I was born in Atlanta, grew up in Georgia. We moved to Ohio. My parents live in California. I went to school in Ohio, but did my graduate work in Washington and lived in New York. But I'm one of those Americans. I have a place that I consider more of my hometown. But so I hadn't fully appreciated how rooted a lot of Americans are to home place. And that's New Orleans below sea level neighborhoods, particularly the Lower Ninth Ward. You may go to the Lower Ninth Ward and say, why do you want to stay there? But a number of people have brought up there, people like Fats Domino, who won't leave. He could go, he had money, not leaving the neighborhood. And so they're trying to come back, and they're getting a jack-o'-lantern effect. A house open here, Brad Pitt, for example, is building these eco homes, 150 homes right on the Lower Ninth. It's going to be there at the Lower Ninth because the people of that neighborhood, I'm picking just that one neighborhood on the Industrial Canal, aren't going to leave. Yet nobody's providing them services. So it's an ugly kind of scenario going. I gave you pretty much maybe why not to rebuild the below sea level neighborhoods with the wetlands. I didn't even add global warming into the mix, depending if you believe in it or not. You know, most people in America do, but even if you don't, it just suppose that the Gulf, for some reason, is getting warmer every year. So the stress on New Orleans is going to be greater and greater. We do know factually that the Gulf is getting warmer in the summers. This summer, you know, it's been now 2 summers where we've gotten off fairly easy in the Gulf South here. But if you're going to take that one basket, the Bush view then, the Bush policy is, let's not rebuild those below sea level areas, but let's tell people to come back, because that puts the burden on the storm victim, and we don't have to take the political flack for it. And eventually they'll get it, and over a 5, 6, 7 year period, those neighborhoods won't work. And people naturally, commerce, business, why won't they work? The banks in the Lower Ninth. I talked to the head of a major bank, the biggest bank down there. They're not going to give anybody a loan to build below sea level in the Lower Ninth. Insurance companies aren't covering people that live below sea level in these neighborhoods now. They've tried reneging the insurance companies on a number of policies. They're not signing up new people's home insurance policies to live below sea level in New Orleans. It's not happening. How do you build a sustainable community in those places? So that's the Bush view. My main criticism with that is just of thinking is that it's not straight talk. It's not telling people, here's our policy. It's playing a lot of games with people's lives. That's the criticism of it. The positivism of it, it's kind of brutally frank at it, and maybe a reality. If we have $1 trillion debt, we're fighting wars on terror right now in Afghanistan, Iraq, do we have the billions of dollars to do this? It would cost about $50 billion, maybe 60, and all of you know estimates are usually low on these kind of big projects, to make Category 5 levees in New Orleans and to deal with the wetlands problem. We're looking at a price ticket as a nation. This is a federal problem ultimately. 50 or 60 billion, and that could mushroom up when you really start getting the bills going. That would be the biggest public works project in American history. It would dwarf the interstate highway system of Dwight Eisenhower, which is standing as the biggest public works project. I mean, you're talking, you know, Panama Canals times 200 here. It's a huge engineering. It has to be sold as a national mission. It cannot be done by compromise. And here's $1 billion, and here's $2 billion, and we'll patch this and patch, because you're still creating a stressed out system. Why do it? Maybe if you could say Bush is correct, the Bush administration's, look, okay, Bush isn't being direct. He doesn't want to get in a political buzzsaw. Katrina whacked him. I mean, his numbers in the polls started sinking. All you have to do is look at August 2005 and watch President Bush's presidency head southward. Everybody says it's Iraq. It's when he started losing Republicans on the efficiency effort during Katrina that Bush's administration got into problems. He could have weathered Iraq, but he couldn't weather Katrina. And his very slow and unemotional appeal during that week, the fact that he did a flyover with Air Force One and didn't put his boot heels on the ground and touch the floodwaters, has hurt him greatly. And it's not me saying this, it's a professor at the White House admits it. Karl Rove is the one who gave Bush the advice not to go to Louisiana. And the Secret Service will always tell presidents not to go. Always. But there was a window there when he needed his Reagan moment, how Reagan would step up with the Challenger. Bill Clinton did it at Oklahoma City. Giuliani did it during 9/11. President Bush himself had that bullhorn moment after 9/11. He didn't have it during Katrina. He didn't get down there. They got too political. They wanted to blame Blanco for everything because she was this rare Democratic governor. And they got into the politics of blaming Blanco. And then Time magazine found out that Michael Brown had lied on his resume. And the whole White House apparatus turned on Brown. And FEMA was going to be the blame. Because the Bush crowds never liked FEMA all that much. It's a Jimmy Carter created organization. It's been a bit of a stepchild in the administration. They've moved it into Homeland Security and have denigrated FEMA terribly. So they were just going to blame that outfit. The argument for saving the lower ninth, for saving New Orleans, saving below sea level, is a cultural one. If you're not going to get into the cultural argument, then the writing's on the wall that it isn't going to happen. We would have to argue, the case would have to be made in 2008, I believe, in a presidential debate held in New Orleans with Hillary Clinton or Obama or Edwards or Romney or Thompson or Giuliani, that what's the future down here? Do we spend the $50 billion or do we not spend the $50 billion? Do we make this the biggest public works project or do we don't? The argument for saving it goes something like this. New Orleans is a huge American historic city. It's our great ambassador city to the world. It's where the Louisiana Purchase transfer took place. It's where Andrew Jackson defeated the British, giving us our in the War of 1812. It's the literary capital of America with Tennessee Williams and Truman Capote, in music with Louis Armstrong and King Oliver and Buddy Bolin and Faulkner's first novel, and Walt Whitman got the ideas of Leaves of Grass there, and on and on and on. And we have to take a look and say, well, if the Dutch can save Den Haag and Rotterdam and Amsterdam from below sea level, and the Italians can save Venice from below sea level with public works projects of dikes and levees, why can't we in the United States? That's a tough argument. That really gets to the crux, because you're asking who we are as a generation of Americans right now. What are we about? Are we about, now let's move inland? The problem with the moving inland of New Orleans, with the abandonment of below sea level neighborhoods, which is the cultural vibrancy. You kill the below sea level neighborhoods, which are the African American neighborhoods. Yes, white and affluent Lakeview is part of it, but by and large, talking about the African American part of it, what you're doing is killing the culture. That culture won't come back there. New Orleans will become a casino-driven town. Harrah's is making money hands over fists there right now. There'll be casinos lined up from the river to the Superdome. There'll be a jazz hall of fame, and it'll become an adult tourism strip club. Larry Flint's opening 2 more soon. It's going to become an adult playground entertainment. It's not going to become a cultural center. You're not going to have that front porch culture. Some of the mom and pop shops, that old kind of sleepy New Orleans culture which has produced so much great music, not least of jazz, one of the great musical gift of America to the world. And so it's as we're heading in 2 years later, the city's improving on the above sea level part, and things are really hurting in the below sea level part. The small businesses are hurting, but casinos are booming. Remember, it's the most important fact of thinking about New Orleans and why the royal federal government, Minneapolis, St. Paul, have at any given time 21 Fortune 500 companies just north of the river. 21. Look how many we have, loads of them here in Houston. You're dealing with one, Entergy of New Orleans. In New Orleans, Entergy, a subdivision of Entergy, has been bankrupt. There actually been great corporate leaders, Entergy, by not pulling out. I don't know how long they're going to be able to pull that off. They're just catching flack from everybody staying. There's no corporate base there. New Orleans is 2-industry town. Port, which is back, and I think it's going to stay back. And I don't think it's on the table. I think it's back, and it's good news. Tourism, which is very down. Tourism's going to be hard to get as many people. I saw last night on Fox News, there's a new television show on Fox, not the news channel, I'm sorry, not Fox News, Fox Entertainment, about New Orleans, which is just bang, bang, murder, 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 murder. It's an awful infomercial for the future of New Orleans. The problem New Orleans is having now is it's got an increased murder rate since Katrina, 47%. Crime is going way up. The people I've talked to from the FBI who've come in and taken over the police department because of corruption. You had cops that left during the storm, but then you had widespread corruption. The FBI's come in and try to clean it up, and they will tell you, the FBI, it's kind of like we underestimated it, like Baghdad. We thought we'd get in here, a bunch of drug dealers, and clean this place up fast. We're the feds, and it's endemic cultural corruption that they couldn't anticipate the degrees of it. So this is all kind of in the mix. So when I present here today at the Baker Institute is, as is this country, 2 years, and we're heading into the third years, that we do look at Katrina in 2008. The good news for us right now is nothing's too late in the big sense, the big historical sense. Remember, the Dust Bowl didn't happen. Here was the Dust Bowl happened in a week. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s went on for 7, 8 years. We're in the middle of Katrina now. People will be looking back at this decade of how we responded to Katrina 100 years from now. And it's not going to be determined, well, this is what they did in 2005 and 2006 or 2007. The big question is, how did America deal with the sinking of New Orleans? And I believe that the most honest approach is in 2008 to debate it as a country with two proposals essentially on the table. A, we step up in the federal government with all of our other obligations, and it announces that we're going to have the boldest public works project in American history, and we're going to build the levees, and it's going to take us 10, 12 years to get them safe, but we're investing this kind of national commitment to New Orleans. Or we say that we're not going to be, we are cutting loose of those below sea level neighborhoods, that they can't be sustained, we can't make them sustainable, livable communities, and services will not be provided for people there. And deal with that exodus issue, deal with the death of below sea level New Orleans in an upfront, candid way. I think the clear choice of those two makes sense. Usually, in a democracy, we love the give and take of compromise. The gravity of what's hit New Orleans now can't be done in piecemeal checks. And I'm not talking little checks. We're talking, we are spending billions. We are pouring it, but are we pouring it down a rat's hole? And let's not do that. If we're going to pour it, let's do it right. I've been amazed as an American historian how somehow in our country people have lost that big image. I don't know what's occurred. I mean, I won't waste our time out loud telling you some theories, but we used to be up for big challenges like that in this country, and people aren't in for. I mean, it would be laughable to Franklin Roosevelt that the United States, who created more public works projects than you could shake a stick at, in the New Deal, that the United States wanted to retreat from New Orleans. And Theodore Roosevelt was president when the San Francisco earthquake hit, and look how we've rebuilt San Francisco. Some people think it's foolish that we redid it. Why? When the people left San Francisco, they all headed inland. People said that's the end of San Francisco forever. And generations of Americans came back, including Theodore Roosevelt, said, let's rebuild it. Today, they're hopefully earthquake-proof buildings. I'm much more frightened of Los Angeles, to be honest with you, with the interstates if a big earthquake hits down there, or Palm Springs, which I love dearly. It's one of my favorite places in the world is Palm Springs, and they're right on that fault. And you're building. Look, but the one argument I want to tell you is you don't want to think about. We have to get over just beating up on New Orleans to this degree. Like, then get out of below sea level. We have to ask ourselves: is every disaster we're just going to abandon it? If an earthquake hits L.A., well, just abandon Los Angeles. If the Hamptons gets wiped out, do we abandon Long Island? Does Cape Cod gets hit by a hurricane? Do we just leave it? I don't know. Maybe the answer is yes. I mean, boy, buy your real estate in Kansas right now. And then you're going to have our tornado. Coastal living's rough. We all like to be on the water's edge. People like it. It's, the point of Pontchartrain in New Orleans, and I interview guys that write about my book. I met a wonderful guy named Michael Knight, the most unlikely Katrina hero. He had an African-American guy with long reggae hair, and who lives and feeds his kids off of fishing for redfish on Lake Pontchartrain in his little boat. He's like a quasi-fisherman, and he does some framing odd jobs on the way back. But he had his boat when Katrina hit, and he saved like hundreds of people. The Coast Guard started relying on him because he'd go to these wild places, and they'd point the Coast Guard to Michael's boat, and he'd get these guys. He was stoned half the time. This is the most extraordinary, these kind of characters you meet. Like he stepped up, this guy, when the Katrina hit, and I kept saying, Michael, you're a smart guy, you're industrious. When do you stand down here like this? He got 3 kids there. He said, I can't leave the neighborhood, man. Can't leave it. I can't not fish these waters. I can't. His attachment, there is so great. And he's just one of many people that we live by the water. I mean, look, everybody knows Katrina hit. Do you think real estate's being hurt in Florida right now? I was in Vero Beach one year. I went back the next year, and you almost don't recognize it anymore, that Central Florida coast. It takes some slowdowns, but people still going right back to the Florida coast. People are pouring into California. So we got to ask ourselves, what do we do as a society? Do we build different houses? Do we build it? But building a levee system around New Orleans is a sustainable idea. But in a time when we don't like raising taxes and we're very overcommitted, I think the Bush administration they learned, in my opinion, the big lesson from Lyndon Johnson. They're terrified. Even the Bush family they loved Lyndon Johnson, but they're also everybody was a little scared of Lyndon Johnson in Texas. He was so powerful, and they watched this most powerful, man since FDR really, from raw political power, turn into a tiny man with long hair, smoking like rolled cigarettes out in his ranch. He got so burned by Vietnam, mixed with the Great Society and deficit spending, and he tried to do everything. So I think the sense of the Bush administration is one big mission at a time. Our mission is the war on terror. The question is, can we have the capacity as a nation to do 2 big things: fight a war on terror and pour money into infrastructure, and particularly localized infrastructure of Louisiana? Because people in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa, here's what they say. If I really knew they would build the levees right and there wouldn't be people stealing money, I'd be for it. But I'm not going to be for a huge pork barrel $50 million project that's going to go bust. If it really knew it could be done right, sign me up. But right now, I'm not convinced. I'm looking at these clowns running things. It's got a culture of corruption, the murder rate, the crime, all this. I'm not there. So I think the next president, this is not an issue the Bush administration is going to deal with any more than they have. It'll be a next president to make a decision. We will know by 2012 what's the future of New Orleans. That's where we're at. By one more administration after this one, we will know whether there was federal presidential leadership, which would have to bring in the Fortune 500 CEOs, would have to bring in faith-based groups, would have to lead a huge national effort, say, let's solve this. We're Americans. Let's solve this problem. If that doesn't happen, I think you're going to see New Orleans as a micro city of just the above sea level part. City that'll still be fun to visit, but a city that won't be culturally essential anymore. It'll become, in many ways, a bit of a tomb or an artifact of a previous era. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. And Doug is ready to take any questions and have a discussion with you. John, you want to start off?
Yes, sir. It's an excellent question. It's asking about after Galveston with the filling. That's what's going on. That's what they're trying to do now. The problem they're finding is they're raising it at some neighborhoods. The housings they're trying to put back up about 6 inches. And you're looking at places that got hit with 8 feet of water. That's what am I saying, is the piecemeal going to work? Are we going to put all of our resources into 6-inch lifts when 8 feet of water come in next time? There's a lot of well-meaning people that are trying to do things in New Orleans right now. A lot of nonprofit groups. What they quickly learn. If you went to I'll just say lower ninth again, or if you went down there right now, what you notice is a lot of Habitat for Humanity, like let's put up houses, let's help people groups, church groups very involved. You won't see government trucks. You're not seeing the U.S. government. The government has put its money, your money, our money, taxpayers' money, on really three main areas. The Homeland Security focused on securing the port, which they've been successful. The FBI's attempt to change the organized crime and the difficulties there, which they're struggling with, but I think will ultimately be successful. And the Army Corps of Engineers, which is being asked to do a kind of impossible task of doing patchwork on a system that needs totally rehauled. One of the arguments of the rebuild is that the federal government built them badly, so shouldn't they fix them right? That's a big argument out there for fixing them. That why are these people being victimized? They were told these levees were built properly. The whole thing was built as a boondoggle. You know, any of you here, I don't know anybody in construction business. You all have homes. You know the difference between a good construction job and a bad one. You know that you can pay somebody to come fix your house and then the problem's back the next day. This whole levee system is very suspect in the New Orleans area, and it's got environmental problems with it too. There were a lot of Superfund sites. Texas has often treated Louisiana as a third world place. It's a place to extract your resources and bring it back, bring the booty back here to Houston or Dallas in the oil business and in the shipping business. So New Orleans has been left out on the so-called New South equation. The New South exists. It's Memphis with Federal Express, and it's Houston with its medical complexes and oil and space, on and on. It's Charlotte with banking. It's Atlanta with Home Depot and Atlanta. You know, go all the big southern cities. New Orleans doesn't have that. Louisiana politicians, since the time of Huey Long and before, have allowed the state to be gouged by payoffs, things. So everybody came in to just take from the state. So there's not a lot of money in Louisiana. The city of New Orleans is broke. I'm not talking, I mean, here at Baker Institute, I don't know what ledgers show, but I can promise you they're not zero. All right?
No, we're in the black.
Close.
But we always want more.
I mean, you're dealing with zero money in New Orleans. The city's broke. The whole city's broke. That's why this has become a federal. Nobody in America has been harder on Ray Nagin, and I continue to be, on his ridiculous, lackluster leadership and just kind of raw buffoonery that goes on with him. But he can't fix the problem. What he's hurt on the rebuild is the public relations side of it. Because once he started playing with racial politics and started saying kind of kooky things, he turned a lot of people off about the rebuild of New Orleans. So he's been a bad ambassador. But changing mayors would only help marginally. It helped perception-wise, but it wouldn't help the problem's too big. Only the federal government can really save that city. Yes, sir.
Yes. If you have a best-case scenario, if you have the commitment of $50 billion and a national will to improve the infrastructure, if over a decade's time the levees are built as they should be, you're still looking at the problem of the degradation of the wetlands through the levees themselves, through the oil canals. There's been terrible erosion. Is there time, and I don't believe there's really been any effective, there have been some experiments in replenishing the wetlands, but is there time, is there a way to deal with something that massive?
Well, there is a way. We have the technology both with wetlands restoration and with the building of the levees. So it takes massive amounts of money and willpower, and the question is, do we have both of those for it? Again, I can't put more explanation points. This would have to be a huge national effort. We would have to have everybody say, yeah, let's do it. You'd have to have a kind of leader that want to. I don't see it on the horizon, except the only scenario I see presidential leadership-wise, I may be wrong about this, But I heard Hillary Clinton gave a big health care talk today on it's a very expensive package, hugely expensive package. I don't think she's going to be able to float that she's going to do a health care revamp and rebuild New Orleans on the Democratic side, which I think the Katrina issue, the New Orleans issue, will fall to Edwards, who's pushing poverty issues so hard, and maybe Obama, who's eyeing it. So if Edwards won Iowa and Edwards shocked people and got second in New Hampshire, and then Edwards went on and won South Carolina, he may have Nevada too because of the unions, and took off as the challenger to Hillary, he may very well put that rebuilding effort of wetland, a whole package deal as one of his catch bits. But I don't, on the Republican side, I don't believe Thompson or Giuliani want to go that route, or Mitt Romney. They've indicated, they haven't shown any flare signals that they would want to. And the problem that Republicans have is that they don't really like the word Katrina. It's not a fundraiser for them, you know. I mean, it isn't. Let's be honest about it. I mean, whatever, you know, they do better on the war on terror, and we're going to be strong and all this. Katrina was in a bit of an embarrassment for the Republican Party because they were in control of Congress and the Senate and the White House at the time, and so they can blame Blanco for things, but you know the burden of mistakes, contemporary mistakes, falls on them. To be quite fair to President Bush, he takes somewhat too much blame on all of this in the sense that he's not the one who built the bad levees. You know, this has been a long time problem he inherited. So it's a lot of bad luck on his part. But I'm short of now. Somebody could surprise you. You know, Giuliani has in particular has a capacity to think big and take on things. His personality is a little bit that way. I noticed today he's taking on he's milking that, going after move.org, you know, moveon.org a lot today. He's going after, he leaps at things a lot. If Giuliani gets in a certain kind of mindset and is given a certain proposal, he's a fairly non-ideological, fluid guy who might potentially do something there. I hate to say, it doesn't seem like the only other chance for New Orleans, if you take government out of it, would be that these grassroots people's movement in the below sea level neighborhoods just grow. And I think that's what the people down there meaning. We don't care whether we'll then create our own schools in a trailer. You're not going to do our garbage pickup, we'll do community garbage pickup. You're not going to provide this, then we'll bring jugs of water. There's a sentiment going there. I don't know how long large groups of people can sustain that kind of attitude, whether that grit and it wears on you after a while. It sounds romantic and noble, and it's pretty good for a year or two. I don't know if that's sustainable for those people after, 5 years with zero kind of pure infrastructure going on. But the houses are popping up, and they're saying we're not leaving. Incidentally, in the lower ninth, the federal government is helping rebuild, as is the state, the National Guard headquarters, which is Jackson Barracks in the lower ninth on the border of Chalmette, which is below sea level. And they're pouring in so much money there, so the residents of the lower ninth are saying, hey, if it's so bad living here, why are you keeping the National Guard headquarters there? And why are you pouring all that money into it there? You're just ignoring us because we're poor, or we're middle class, and when race comes into it, or we're black. And yes, ma'am.
You were saying that the port is viable, and that's a huge percentage of our national tonnage that goes through there. Obviously, that's very important to everybody in this country. How can the port be viable and nothing else except touristy Garden District and the French Quarter? What keeps the port viable? Is there no connection to the Ninth Ward and to the culture?
No. What keeps the port viable is that it's along those Mississippi River levees. If you cling to the river, that part of New Orleans is functioning. Because they were never built badly, it was only the Lake Pontchartrain levees. You see, the Mississippi River levees never breached. The Mississippi River itself levees were built properly, which is the good news. The bad news is look on a map how big Lake Pontchartrain is and see it's just this funnel of water with canals coming into it that's become like a wind tunnel trap with the opening of these various waterways through it. So that's the part that you'd have to save. And that's the part that's connected to the wetlands that's disappearing. So literally while we've been here, whatever you did today, Louisiana's lost 2 football fields worth of land. Now, people go to war over losing land like that. And that's how much of Louisiana is now, disappearing. And so, put another way, every day the Gulf of Mexico is getting closer to New Orleans. It's 60 miles from it's located approximately 60 miles from the Gulf, and that number is shrinking. So, if nothing's done, you're going to find New Orleans sitting right on the Gulf, where you start cutting 20 miles of that hurricane force, and then it'll rip out the barrier islands. And you have subpar levees. You'd hate to see people building homes in Lower Ninth just to watch them go right back down. Yes, sir.
The idea of New Orleans as a fixed location, it's the one that we've been using for this hour. But New Orleans 9th Ward is in Houston now. I wonder what you would have to say about, or a lot of it, about the challenge of an historian of New Orleans, the city, when the New Orleans, its people have been extracted finally. Like the resources have been extracted for this long, and now the people are in Houston or in Baton Rouge. How do you tell a story? How do you tell that history?
Well, it's an Exodus story. It's a story of dislocation. That's only greater dislocation we've had was the Civil War. All the people coming back after the war and the soldiers, around this huge moment of dislocation. We had, as I mentioned, the Dust Bowl years of dislocation. So it's not a happy story, obviously. No matter how you feel in the future of New Orleans, everybody feels terrible that people's homes and neighborhoods got destroyed like this. It's cultural. You'd have to approach it as a diaspora story of one of resettlement Houston was a great hero in the whole Katrina story. The city absorbed everybody here, and they did a stellar job up at Reliant, including the governor, and everybody did here. The mayor, White, was amazing. The problem we're having now is creating people that don't want to be here, that they're coming from another culture, they're having trouble assimilating due to a number of factors, that you have to look at why that assimilation is so difficult. New Orleans is a very unique culture. It's almost, some people call it the capital of the Caribbean, it used to be called. It's a different kind of place, and it's not that easy for some people are obviously left New Orleans and are humming along and having great lives somewhere, but a lot of people haven't adjusted in 2 years. A lot of people just say, I want to go home. And they're wondering why there's all this massive inaction and why aren't people doing what they said they were going to do. You have to feel for the people that have filled out FEMA applications and dealt with FEMA on the telephone. Any of your worst bureaucratic nightmares, multiplied by 10, it's a bureaucratic nightmare, which is another question that has to be decided in 2008. I agree with Trent Lott, who once as early was an advocate of pulling FEMA out of Homeland Security. I'm not sure it's functioning the way it needs to in a larger group. That's going to be debated. Does FEMA deserve a cabinet-level person? Should it be its own entity and be funded properly, or is it a sort of adjunct thing? So there's still a lot of issues, I think, with it. But people's stories, it's ones of lost neighborhoods of culture on the run. It's like if you look at Africa or anywhere there's refugee, not that that's the word I'm using for Katrina, evacuees, but those kind of situations of dislocation create, to be problems. We have many Americans, 2-3 generations that come from that kind of cataclysm of natural disaster, potato famine, or Holocaust, or something that moves people from their country to America, in those cases, to start over. There's a challenge to those people that have relocated to try to start a new life somewhere. Some are successful, some miss home too much and want to come back. Some are defiant. that they've lived for 4 generations in New Orleans and they're not happy anywhere else, and I'm going back. Some feel cowardly to leave their city. That why would they leave where their whole ancestors were from? What does it say about them? Place for some people is larger, is as tight as blood. Some people it means nothing place. So, it's an individual. You look at it individually too, but it's certainly a disproportionate number of African Americans are affected, and it's a big moment in African American history. And I think Spike Lee's documentary, When the Levees Broke, is a very potent and powerful first crack at some of that problems for African American culture. Also, Michael Eric Dyson wrote a book, professor at Georgetown University, that's very good on race and Katrina. It's a big issue, race and Katrina, more than I have time for today. I'm going to take one more question, and then I better stop. Yes, sir.
You talk about the success of the Coast Guard and the failure of FEMA. Both organizations were led kicking and screaming into the Homeland Security.
Yes.
So what accounts for the success and the failure?
That's a good question. The point he's making is both FEMA and Homeland Security and FEMA and Coast Guard are part of Homeland Security. Why did one do badly and why did the other not? Leadership of the Coast Guard, first off. Second, the Coast Guard does rescue, and they've done it for a long time, and they do it well, and they know how to interact with the Navy and with the Army. The 82nd Airborne, for example, when Bush finally called them, he waited too long. I interviewed the men of the 82nd, the leaders of the 82nd Airborne wanted to come in right after the storm. The Bush administration held them up. So if you interview the people of the 82nd Airborne, they were like, we were ready. We were asking, send us, send us, send us, and we were getting held up. Eventually, a week later, Bush sent them. FEMA had a huge problem. One problem of it is Michael Chertoff, the head of Homeland Security, could not stand Michael Brown. They're two different parts of the Bush energy, and Brown was getting denigrated a lot. Brown made the bad decision early. He only had 2 FEMA guys on the ground. This guy, Marty Bahomet, who's become a bit of a folk hero in the Superdome, with the roof blowing in, was like, he was emailing Brown, I'm telling you, I don't care what you guys are hearing. It's not so bad. This is nuts down here. And Brown was, as you know, was being made fun of a lot, was writing emails back, I've got to walk my dog, and if I can find a babysitter for my poodle, I will be. And he became a national joke, Brown, because of his kind of fickle leadership. He's a very nice man, incidentally, and a very competent guy in some ways. It's baffling that that he couldn't get a handle on it. And the Coast Guard operates as the military does, kind of on their own in a way. Chertoff kept such a stranglehold on his new trophy, FEMA, that when Bush was in San Diego at Camp Pendleton, it was August, and Karl Rove was on vacation in Maine, and Dick Cheney was on vacation in Wyoming, and Andy Card was running the White House, who they subsequently got rid of. And Card was notoriously afraid of Bush's temper and of giving the president bad news. And Michael Chertoff assured Card to tell the president, everything's okay. Everything is under control. And Chertoff is the one who, when 80% of New Orleans was flooding, didn't recognize it and led the president that I got it under control. He didn't want to worry President Bush about it. I don't have the time to get into all the reasons why Chertoff didn't, but they were unrolling that very day of Katrina their biggest Iraq war policy shift initiative, where the president had ships coming behind him in San Diego, and he was for the first time coming to the American people and saying, Iraq is like Japan after World War II. MacArthur thought the rebuilding of Japan would take a year, and the occupation took MacArthur 7 years. We need some more time. Now we know the problems of Iraq and all its history. The Baker Institute here has been part of it, has taken over. But at that moment in 2005, that was a big policy rollout that these guys had planned for weeks. And Chertoff didn't want to see the president ripped off of that for a hurricane. I can handle the hurricane, Mr. President. He didn't. What's strange is that he wasn't fired, Michael Chertoff. But apparently he does such a good job on other issues of homeland security, on terrorism and securing of airports and ports, that he's considered almost indispensable to President Bush. And they decided to focus it all on Michael Brown. Brown and Chertoff probably should have been fired in a normal circumstance. I better stop or I'll go on all night. Thank you.